Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we have one of those topics that I just love to bring to PreserveCast because it was new for me. And if it's new for me, I hope it's new for some other listeners out there. And it's just so exciting to dive into something like that and learn from a different perspective. We're going to be talking about a new book out called Africa's Buildings, Architecture and the Displacement of Cultural Heritage. And we're going to be talking with the author, Dr. Itohan Osayimwese, who is a professor of history and art and architecture and urban studies at Brown University, where she is an affiliate faculty in Africana Studies at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And she's also the author of Colonialism and Modern Architecture in Germany and the editor of German Colonialism in Africa and Its Legacies. And what a absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to sit down and talk with her and understand more about this really important topic. You know, before we dive into it, though, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. And, this is an interesting perspective on preservation. And I think it's made more interesting because of your background as well. Which is an important part of the story. It comes through in the book, and I would love to get to know you. So tell us a little bit, Ito, about where you grew up and how that shaped your interest in the work that you do today.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. I'm super excited to be here. So I have a little bit of an unusual background. I was born in Nigeria, in southwestern Nigeria specifically, in a city called Ibadan, which is one of the oldest kind of indigenous West African cities. My parents were from 2 different countries. My father was from Nigeria and my mother was from Barbados in the Caribbean. And that really sort of course, inflects my own sort of history, my interest, and so on. So I was born in Nigeria. I went to school there until I was about 13 years old in several different parts of the country. And then when I was 13, my family moved, mainly for economic reasons, to Europe. And so I went to high school in Vienna, in an international school, English speaking, but I did learn German there. So German is more or less my second language. And then from high school in Vienna, I went to college in the United States. I went to Bryn Mawr College, just outside of Philadelphia. And then graduate school at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And then I completed my schooling with my PhD at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. So very, itinerant, I suppose you could say, upbringing. I've been in the U.S. for many years now, but I consider the United States, Barbados, and Nigeria all to be my homes. Yeah.
I mean, well, I want to read that book. Right? Like, no, I'm not even joking. Like, that just sounds like a really fascinating sort of series of experiences, because Rice University and Vienna, I probably couldn't be more different. So, and obviously that, shapes all of this. During all of those varied experiences, was architecture and art and history always a passion, always an interest? Did you kind of know, like, this is where I'm headed, or were you on the path to become something else and then took a detour?
Yeah, no, it was always where I was headed, on various levels. First of all, as I said, I grew up in the city that is like a historical city, and then within that city, I grew up on a college campus. And so, in other parts of the world, not in the United States primarily, in other parts of the world, college campuses are basically cities in which the professors live, the students live, staff members live. They're kind of like gated communities. So I grew up on one of those. And it was a designed college campus, designed sort of in the mid 20th century by a famous British architect couple, Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew. And so the house I grew up in, I mean, I didn't know it at the time, but I always thought, okay, well, certainly my experience living on this campus, growing up on this campus, the kinds of buildings around me, very different from the historical city outside of the, gates and hedges of the campus. So I always knew there was something unique about that. Of course, later on, I found out all about the architects and all of that. So that really, I think, is the beginning of my story of becoming interested in the built environment, just living in a place that was very intentionally designed. And, even as a young child, that was evident to me. And then I had an uncle sort of in my early teens who was an architect. So it's kind of the stereotypical architect origin story. I knew someone. I liked, playing with blocks and building things. This is actually all true for me. So my uncle, he'd gone to MIT, and he was the only person I knew who actually had studied architecture, and he designed his own house. And I thought it was like a modernist house, like all white, flat roofs. This is in Nigeria, right? And it was an amazing house. And so I was inspired by that. I used to for my mother's birthday, I would make models of built out of cardboard for her as a birthday present when I was little. So, I mean, generally I was probably headed in that direction. I ended up going to college to study chemistry, though.
Okay, so because I was going to say, it seems like a more clear version of this than we normally get. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, well, first I did this thing, and then I found my way." This seems very straightforward, except for this diversion to chemistry.
Right. So I knew I wanted to study architecture, but it seemed that it was primarily a second degree. And I do think it is largely a second degree. Even though you can study architecture as an undergrad, you still need a graduate degree in architecture. And so what I decided to do, with the encouragement of my parents, they were like, "Well, you do really well in, chemistry in school. Why don't you go study chem?" I was like, "Okay, sure. I'll go study chemistry." So I went to college to study chemistry. I was taking all those chemistry classes, the scary ones, organic chemistry and things like that. And, I was doing okay in them, but I wasn't enjoying them. And I was taking all of these history of architecture courses as electives just for fun. And eventually, by sophomore year, I realized I pretty much had the full major in the history of architecture. And I really did not like my chemistry classes. And so I called my parents, because I was an international student. My parents were in Austria, in Vienna, and I was here in the US, and just outside Philadelphia. And I said, I'm going to switch majors. And they said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I really don't like this chemistry thing." And they said, "But you're doing okay." And I said, "Yeah, but imagine how much better I would do if I actually enjoyed what I was doing." Yeah. So that was the beginning of the kind of pathway towards becoming an architectural historian.
So, I mean, I knew just like a little tiny piece of this, having read the book. I mean, you refer obviously growing up in Africa, but this level of detail paints an even greater picture, and it makes even more sense about why you wrote what you wrote, right? I mean, because it comes through that this is almost the perfect book for you to write in a way, right? Because it's you are going to all these different places where this takes place in the book, and so you've seen it from so many different perspectives. It just it really comes through, and it's wonderful in that way. For people who obviously haven't read the book yet, we'll put a link in the show notes where you can pick it up. I was telling Ito before that one of my major pet peeves with academic presses oftentimes is that there's not enough good photography. And in this one, you blew it out of the park. Like, there's just beautiful color photography, which is rare to see. And it's in, there's a bunch of it. And it really illustrates in a way a book that is so visually important to understand what you're talking about, particularly if you're not familiar with it. And so it's wonderful. Pick up a copy of it. We'll put the links in the show notes. For people who aren't familiar with it, though, we're obviously talking about cultural displacement and displacement of architecture of Africa's actual buildings. Where did the impetus come for writing this book on the heels of the other ones that you wrote? Where did this all come together?
Right. That's a good way to frame the question, because it does come on the heels of, previous work I'd done and other books I'd written, which were about sort of the history of, colonialism as it intersects with the built environment, looking at, the buildings that colonial empires, let's say the German colonial empire, the British colonial empire, created in their colonies across Africa in particular. So that's kind of my previous work. And thinking about how their experience on the African continent may have, and certainly did, in fact, inflect, developments in architecture back at home in Germany and in Britain. So that's sort of my earlier work. And as I finished up that earlier work, I started to think about the contemporary moment and to think about what are the legacies of this colonial past, the material cultural legacies in our built environment of this colonial past. And one of those legacies, which became very clear to me, mainly through my teaching, because, I teach classes I teach a variety of classes, but one of the classes that I teach quite regularly at all of the different universities I've taught at, is a course introducing students to the history of African architecture, African built environments, African urbanism. And I've always struggled in that course because it's very difficult to find images to illustrate my lectures.
Yeah, you talk about that, I think, in the book, right, where you're like, I thought you kind of made me even like chuckle, where you were like, I'm using like Lonely Planet pictures, like,
absolutely,
and that's just kind of wild when you think about the amount of information that's out there on everything nowadays.
Right. I mean, humanity, emerged on the African continent. Why is it that we don't have visual illustrations of this very old continent's, built environment, right? And so, a lot of my colleagues, they have beautiful pictures that, of ancient Greece or whatever it is, or contemporary, modernism in France or something, right? That they show in their lectures. But it was very difficult for me to find images to just, really bring home and clarify for students what we're talking about. And when I did find images, they tended to be images of fragments of buildings that were and these images came from museum catalogs and museum collections here in the US and also in Europe. And I used to ignore them because that's not useful to me necessarily as an architectural historian. We tend to talk about entire structures, not little pieces of buildings, right?
Like, I guess in like
spaces,
a North American context, it'd be like, you're talking about Georgian architecture, but you're going to just show people a chair rail.
Exactly. That's really not useful. I mean, it's useful for certain types of discussions, but if you're talking about, the built environments and architecture, the, entire buildings, spaces, places, little fragments of chair rail are really not helpful. So for many years, I ignored these images. And as you said, I resorted to like Lonely Planet and just, people's travel blogs, anything I could find that would have even a contemporary picture of, historical buildings from the African continent. And then eventually I realized there's something going on with this. So why is it that I keep finding these fragmentary, elements of buildings in these museum catalogs and so on. And then just, gradually I put two and two together and realized this was actually a kind of outcome of colonialism, right? And an outcome of the fact that, many European colonial empires actively collected, pieces of material and visual culture. And in fact, included in that would have been pieces of architecture and buildings, right? And as well as everyday objects and anything you could imagine, plant samples, seeds, everything. They collected everything during the colonial period and brought them back to Britain, to France, to Germany, to Italy, to all the colonial empires, right? And then these objects now constitute one of the major parts of any collection in any museum in these places, including here in the United States. Of course, the United States did not directly colonize any place on the African continent, but was, connected to the colonial empire, obviously through its connection to Britain, and then also through just actively sending people, scholars, museologists, historians, ethnographers to the African continent as well to explore it, and in the course of exploring, to collect objects and bring them back to be displayed in museums. And so again, I put two and two together and finally realized that what I was seeing was actually one of the major material legacies of colonialism, and that no one had really thought about these objects, which tend to be displayed in museums as, if it's an art museum, it's kind of like a work of art. If it's an anthropological museum, it's just like, a thing, an object related to a certain culture, right? But you don't really get in the museum labels and in the catalogs and so on, and understanding that this came from a larger building or object, right? And so that's really what this book is about. It's about tracing what turns out to be a pretty large quantity of African architectural heritage that is now in museums in the United States. I focused on the United States and several countries in Western and Central Europe.
Yeah, and I feel like when you talk about it in terms of dismemberment, is a term that you use. It strikes and it kind of paints it in a slightly different picture than just collecting. That was a term that definitely resonated with me throughout the book, and in the way that you kind of described this, and it makes sense, right? It's like back to that like chair rail example. It's like ripping something out of a building. It is a dismembered piece, and you actually like define dismemberment and kind of get into that. I also thought it was really interesting, and this is early on, and in these conversations here on a podcast, we can't get into every last detail of the book. The whole point is to pick up the book and read it and get people to buy it. But one of the interesting things is you kind of define, you're like, okay, well, what is African architecture? And I love that because you really kind of paint a very clear picture, almost through defining what it isn't. It's unfortunate that you have to define it in these terms, but you're like, there is no such thing as African architecture, first off, right? Because you're talking about a continent. And when I sort of thought about it that way too, I'm like, yeah, I've never heard somebody say North American architecture.
Right.
Right. Because then that's like absurd. Because the architecture of Utah is very different from the architecture of Maine.
Right.
And even in indigenous societies, it was extremely different. The longhouses versus a wigwam or whatever you might be dealing with. And so, for people who are just listening to this and aren't familiar with the argument that you're making here, how do you define African architecture? How do you sort of the 101 course that you teach on this,
right.
How do you even get them to start thinking about this?
Right. Yeah. No, you've already sort of answered the question to some degree and given some examples. So I would define African architecture as, anything built by people of African descent. And I tend to think about African architecture not just as limited to the continent, but also to including the diaspora. I don't get into that much in the book, but I do think, you can trace continuities, and there are people who have done that, trace continuities between, certain types of buildings that were built, let's say, in West Africa historically, and then when you look at the buildings constructed by enslaved people, let's say in the southern colonies in the United States, there are certain similarities, and also in the Caribbean, right? So it can be quite a large kind of category. But if we are to restrict it just to the continent, just for, for pragmatic reasons, as you said, it's really just a label that we can use to help ourselves try to kind of delimit things geographically. Because, as you said, the continent is huge. There are over 50 countries, and, there are different cultures. And within each country, there are multiple ethnic groups and histories and, former kingdoms and so on. And, in the past, there was a tendency, especially among art historians, but also anthropologists, to really try to sort of define each historical ethnic groups, kind of way of building, and say, okay, the people of, who are known as the Dogon people, for instance, in central Mali, the Dogon people, this is their architecture, right? And yes, it's useful to think in that way, but it also creates problems, because it tends to give the impression that, Africa and African architecture and African history is frozen in time, and that there haven't been changes over time, and that these ethnic groups, are the same as they were hundreds of thousands of years ago or something like this, right? Which is obviously false, right? So yeah, I would define African architecture, broadly speaking, as anything built, let's say, by Africans, for Africans, on the African continent. We can just, make that a pragmatic distinction. And it doesn't have to be, things that are designed by professionals at different points in the history of the African continent and different parts of the African continent. There were professionals who, whether they were masons, who were in guilds, who, passed down knowledge about building from generation to generation. So yes, they have been professionals, but there are also, just like anywhere else in the world, buildings that are vernacular and were, designed by regular people, and are, of course, were still valuable and had, kind of traditions and technologies that were well understood, right? So it includes vernacular structures. It includes, professionally designed structures. It includes the spaces around the structures, so I have a quite broad definition of African architecture. I also want to say that there's a tendency, I think, in popular culture to think, and also, frankly, among, scholars and academics, to assume that when one is talking about Africa, one is really talking about sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. You talk about that in the book. And right. Yeah, I mean, that is always, it's almost like, it seems like it's become like a gotcha question, or you know what I mean, where it's like when people are talking about African architecture and then someone say, yeah, but the pyramids, right?
Exactly.
And it's like, well, no, not yeah, but I mean, it's that's the continent. If you're talking about the continent,
exactly. So part of what I wanted to do in this book was to really look at the entire continent and this history of the displacement and intentional removal of parts of its material culture, which goes way back, right? I focus, let's say, on the 18th, 19th, 20th century, but really this goes way back even to, the Roman Empire in Africa, right?
Right. You talk about this term, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right because I've only ever read it. I haven't said it out loud, but is spolia?
Spolia, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and this, maybe give people an idea, just because that's it's an interesting component of the book, and you talk about it throughout different phases.
Right. So spolia is a Latin word, I believe, and it refers to, pieces of mainly buildings, but artifacts that have been removed from one place and one structure and transported, to another structure. And this term comes up in the Roman period and, throughout, sort of Western, history. This is a term that is seen in historical sources. And spolia in the sort of Roman period was really understood as, a way of impressing upon a people that they had been conquered, right? So you would remove, elements of their material culture in order to kind of, prove that you had conquered them, and in order to kind of convey a sense of, superiority over the conquered culture. Now, spolia can also it can also be more neutral, right? And folks have used it in more neutral terms just to describe anything, any part of a building, part of an object removed from one place and incorporated usually into, a later structure, that would have been built with, let's say, a capital from a Roman column or something like this, right? So that's how we typically think of spolia. And spolia is a term that was used in sort of historical museums and museum catalogs to refer to pieces of buildings that were removed. But over time, that term came into disuse, and we start to see a term replacing it, which is the fragment, architectural fragment. Now, arguably, spolia still kind of, if you understand the sort of origins of the term, it still denotes a certain type of violence, right? Because it's usually a military occupation that leads to spoliation of a place and a structure. But architectural fragment makes it much more neutral, right? It just implies, it's just a piece of a building. There's no sense of the processes through which that building or that fragment, came to be in a museum or in a collection.
Yeah, that was for me was like almost a takeaway of like just how important language is when we're talking about these things and terms. You talk about this in terms of like sculpture versus carving.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right. That comes up multiple times. And it's something that, why are these items when they come from the African continent called carving versus sculpture?
Yeah, no one has really been able to give me a good answer for that. Yeah. So no one can give me a good answer for that. And so, I mean, the conclusion is that there must be some sense that there's something, kind of difference by definition about work that is made by Africans or is comes from the African continent, and therefore we must call it something different, even though when we look at it, we look at the kind of activity, the kind of skill that is involved. It is sculpture, right? So whether it's a wood, what people typically call wood carvings, it's really wood sculpture. Right. And so, language is extremely important. And I make a point throughout the book of, thinking about language and pointing out where language has been used to the detriment of, African history and to the detriment of our understanding of what actually happened historically.
And I'm curious, do you think that, back to this definition of African architecture, is the displacement of this heritage responsible for this sort of more fluid definition, this amorphous definition, or was it the fluid amorphous definition of it that enabled the displacement? Like which comes first, or do they come together?
I think the displacement creates the amorphous definition. Because, obviously in the communities that created these buildings and places and objects, they knew exactly what they were, and they knew what each component was, what its function was. It had a name, right? And so it's in the process of displacement. One of the really interesting things about, writing this book was really reading these, diaries by these explorers or by, collectors or museum officials who went on these missions throughout the African continent in the 19th century, even into the 20th century, reading their firsthand, words, and understanding that, in fact, despite the suggestion otherwise, in most cases, people were not willing to give up their objects. And so it required a lot of subterfuge and violence and, just really bad tactics to get these things from people. Even when things were purchased, right? They were often purchased under, threat of force, right? And so, thinking about that and about the way in which, that's an act of violence and a story that's really hidden. That's something that really, had an impact on me, and that I try to communicate in the book. And that explains why people, once these objects got back or were transported to the US or to Paris or wherever, they often had very little information accompanying them, because if the person who, first quote unquote collected, or the term I like to use is dismembered them, had to do this under the cover of night with a flashlight or a torch, because the people actually refused to sell or to give, this person their stuff. Then they had to do it very quickly. They weren't able to get a lot of information, and we lose all of that contextual information. What part of the building was this? How was it used? Where exactly was it located? We lose all of that information because of the process in which these things were actually collected. So I do think it is, it's the process that leads to this, lack of understanding, really, and lack of context. And
the lack of context is really, it's very apparent once you read the book, and then you kind of remember when you visit a museum or you see something like this. And I've oftentimes wondered, as somebody who's interested in architecture and things like that, well, what was this? It's really pretty, but what was this? And I'm curious, to ask what impact this displacement had on our understanding of architecture or our understanding of these communities. That's too broad a question. I don't know how you could possibly answer that. But do you have specific examples of where there are misunderstandings, very specific ones, as a result of this? Are there ones that really kind of jumped out at you?
That's a good question. I would give the example of a door that is located in the British Museum, and you can go and see it. Today it's right there. It's considered one of the most important sort of pieces of artistic and material heritage. It tends not to be understood as architecture, but I define it as such. From the Yoruba-speaking people of Western Africa, primarily what is now Nigeria, also Cameroon, and the Republic du Benin, and those kinds of areas in West Africa. And this door was taken from a palace in southwestern Nigeria and put on display at a World's Fair, the 1924 Wembley exhibition. In London, in England. And that door, it's today in the museum, it's presented as, a door. But when I look at it, and it's because of, my sort of architectural training, architectural knowledge, architectural background, what I see is much more than a door. To me, a door, really implies just the panel that kind of swings back and forth, right? But when you look at this object on display in the museum, you realize it's not just the panel, the door panel that swings back and forth, but it's the entire kind of structural framework of the door. So the lintel above, the posts on either side, the threshold or lintel below, it's the entire, it's an entire assembly, right? Which was structural. And the question then becomes, how did they remove this entire thing without really compromising the building, right? Because again, it's not just the door panel, but it's the structure that connects the door and its panel to the rest of the building. So that started me thinking, and I realized when I noticed that one of the patterns in terms of types of objects that are very present in these collections in the US and in Western Europe are, doors from various parts of the African continent. And more often than not, it's not just the door panel, but it's the structural components around the door panel that are included. And so for me, that's a real fundamental misunderstanding, right, of how buildings work, and also of what was entailed in the removal of, a work from one place to the other. Famously, today, if you go to the British Museum and you look at this door, it says that, the door was given by the king of this particular, or the chief, really, of this particular village or area in Western Nigeria. And so that it came to the museum with his permission. And, that is true as far as we can tell. But looking into the archives of the British Museum, I read letters, that went back and forth between the British Museum and local British officials on the ground in the 1920s in this region of Nigeria. And they had put in a request, right? It wasn't just that the king woke up one morning and said, hey, you want my door and, everything that holds it up from my palace. But actually they had put in a request, right? And asked the king if he would lend them this door to put on display at the exhibition, because the door was sculpted by a sculptor that had come to the kind of become visible in the region, and that the British were starting to understand was a really, very high quality sculptor. His name was Olowe of Ishe, and he sculpted many veranda posts and door columns throughout this region. He was sought after, by elite people in this region to work on their houses. And so he had become famous, and the British had noticed that, and they wanted this door to put on display in the exhibition as an example of kind of indigenous, West African artwork. And so the letters really show that, yes, it was a request. The king or the chief responded and said that he would, in fact, he didn't want to lend it. He would give it to them on the condition that his name was attached to this object, and that it was stated that he had given it to them without any, sort of financial exchange. That didn't really happen until recently. And even today, I believe it's not, his actual name is not stated as a donor of this object, but rather it says, the king of this place, gave this to the museum. And I compare that to the other labels throughout the museum where, this was donated by XYZ, with a particular name at a particular time. So he remains sort of an anonymous donor, which is not what he asked for, at all. And then behind all of that, there's a whole discussion about the kind of economy of gift giving and in a colonial context, right? Did he really have much choice in this particular instance? And so, yeah. Well, I think that's a good example.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's just really great depth and information there, and the kind of information and storytelling you can expect from the book, which again we'll put in the link for the show notes so people can grab a copy. And something that struck me as you were telling that story is that, and that particular account is that that's just one door. And it kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the loss and the stories and the challenges with the multitude of objects that were taken, because we're talking about not in the hundreds or the thousands. We're probably talking about in the millions of objects, and each one of them has a story like that behind it. And that's the richness of history. I mean, there's just, to every object or every incident, there is just this complex story behind them all. But I think that's important to remember when you're seeing that object in a museum, that there is a long story behind it. It did not just arrive there. I'm curious, you obviously, as you kind of draw to the conclusion of the book, it's sort of like recommendations looking towards the future. At this point, with it all, having been removed, what is the process for perhaps taking some of it back? I mean, obviously, in some cases, this happens. Here in the United States, we have NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Repatriation Act, which allows tribal entities to reclaim their objects, funerary objects, and the remains of people that were excavated and taken and removed to collections. Does that hold some type of promise for what could happen with these objects? And if it did, where would they then go? And how would that even happen, particularly in objects where maybe you don't know the exact provenance?
Exactly. Great question, and one that, a lot of people are kind of racking their brains to try to come up with some solutions. And there are no perfect solutions. I do think NAGPRA can offer a model for repatriating and restituting these African architectural elements and just African material culture more broadly speaking, of which, according to some estimates, 90 to 95% of the material culture of the African continent now resides in museums outside the African continent. So that's really problematic. That is really problematic if that is the case. And, to your point, the scale of the loss and the different kind of layers of loss need to be understood better. And I just want to say a few words about that before turning back to the NAGPRA model. And so in terms of what this does, people tend to think, oh, it's just some objects, like, why do we need to bother with this? But what folks need to understand is that if 90 to 95% of Africa's material cultural heritage resides outside of the continent, how is it that Africans are meant to be able to know their own heritage, understand it, and build for the future, right? And so lots of people have made the argument, and I make the argument in this book as well, that this has really caused a disruption in cultural memory across, much of the African continent, right? Folks don't have access to their own history because history is embedded in objects, especially in societies, some of which existed on the African continent, that were not literate and did not write down their histories. Objects offer a different way of memorializing history. And so there's a disruption in knowledge about history. There's a disruption in knowledge about how to make things, and how our ancestors had made things and the technologies they had used, right? So contemporary artists don't have this kind of knowledge of our traditions because we don't have access to them because the examples are not available on the continent. So that's just one sort of level of the ramifications of the kind of loss that folks tend not to think about. And then there are also economic ramifications. African material cultural objects are very valuable these days in these museum collections. They've been traded back and forth and their value has risen and people pay to go see them in museums, right? But the originating communities do not benefit from this. And so there's a sense that could we kind of recalibrate the global economy by repatriating some of these objects, or maybe the majority of them, back to the continent where they could be in museums and people will pay, to come and see them, and tourist economies will be revitalized on the continent because people will no longer need to go to the Louvre to see African works, but will will go to the African continent. So that's just, something I wanted to put out there and something I talk about in the book. And I think the NAGPRA model can offer some ideas for how this can work, pragmatically. Now with NAGPRA, my understanding, and I've seen it at work here in Rhode Island at Brown University. We have an anthropological museum, the Haffenreffer Museum, and for decades, the Haffenreffer Museum has been in dialogue with indigenous communities, around our region in New England and beyond, in terms of, repatriating, returning, preserving, objects from Native American communities. Now, I don't see why that same kind of approach could not be taken up by state and the federal government here in the United States. If there was a policy that was put into place that said, if any museum comes across and acquires knowledge that objects in their collection were acquired through illicit means, then that museum needs to engage in a dialogue with the originating communities, and decisions need to be made about repatriating or about what those communities would like to happen with these objects. So right now, the onus among, in the museum world is on communities to reach out to museums and say, hey, you have our stuff. We would like our stuff back. And for decades and decades and decades, when communities have done that, nothing has happened. But more recently, museums have become more open, I'd say in the last decade, to hearing these claims, to researching provenance, and potentially, returning objects. I think the onus needs to be on the museums, not on the communities who don't know what the museums have, right? These lists and these inventories are not out there. People don't know what elements of their heritage have been taken away. So how can we expect them to request things that they don't know that you have, right? I would suggest that some kind of policy, a broad policy along the lines of NAGPRA, could be really helpful here in the U.S.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it raises just a lot of questions about responsible and ethical, collections and how you curate these things. We're obviously talking, extensively about African heritage as a component of this, but we've run across this before with period rooms in the United States, where they went to take an entire room out of a building in North Carolina and display it, in New York City. And then, interests change, and now it's just in a collection somewhere in a back room, and it might be more meaningful elsewhere. So, yeah, it raises just a lot of big picture questions about how you do this and how you do this ethically and how you engage people. And I think that those are questions that are, well raised in this book. And I'm always interested in traditional skills too. The work of our organization is very focused on trying to create a pathway for people who want to do traditional building techniques here in the United States. And I think it was interesting that you pointed out that the loss of this fabric has created sort of a vacuum for people to continue to do these skills. And I'm curious that if that could be a component as well of bringing these things back and then allowing people in those communities to try and figure out how to recreate these objects. And I don't know if that's been a component of the conversation as well.
I think it should be a component of the conversation. I think, as you said, there's been such a significant loss in knowledge. One example would be the whole kind of question of how to build sustainably, right? And specifically the use of earth as a sustainable material. And I think that if and other types of kind of natural materials in place of, let's say, concrete and steel, and then also how to build in an environmentally friendly and sustainable way. And I think that if we had access, and I say we because I see myself as part of, obviously, an African community. If we had access to some of these objects, these traditional skills and traditional knowledge could be researched. We could gain a better understanding of traditional knowledge and traditional skills, and perhaps see how those skills and knowledge could be applied today and could be very useful again in the construction of environmentally friendly structures, environmentally sustainable ways of living, and so on.
I mean, obviously, looking to the past for answers to the future is an important part of life and civilization. And you bring up some really interesting concepts and topics in this book. Again, the book for listeners is Africa's Buildings, Architecture and the Displacement of Cultural Heritage. We have been speaking with Dr. Itohan Osayimwese, and we've been really diving into this book, and which is the culmination of several different academic pursuits and efforts that she has put forth in her work, and just a great opportunity to sit down. Really enjoyed this. We, again, will put a link in the show notes so people can pick it up. We're looking forward to seeing what you write next. Before we go, we generally ask people who join us if they have a favorite historic place or building, a place that they could return to time and time again that really speaks to them.
Yeah, my favorite historic places change over time. Currently, my favorite place is the Newton Enslaved Burial Ground in Barbados. It's the largest and earliest known intact burial site for enslaved people in the Americas. And as I said before, Barbados is one of my homes. My mother is from there. I'm from there. And there's currently a new memorial that's under construction over there. But even prior to the memorial, I love places where I can sort of think about the resistance of enslaved Africans and how they were able to resist, oppression. And this enslaved burial ground is, you go there and there's just a sense of peace, and it's a mound. It's kind of like an archaeological mound. And then they're building the memorial next to it. And it's just one of my favorite places right now.
Well, it's a perfect place to end this conversation. Ito, it's been a pleasure to be able to have the chance to sit down with you and talk to the person who pulled this work together. And looking forward to seeing what you write next and having you back here on PreserveCast. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.